One evening, my best friend, Pastor Paul Casey, and I had the opportunity to go to a hockey game. Now, it wasn't a pro game like the Montreal Canadiens. It was one of those farm teams owned by the Toronto Maple Leafs, and they were called the Newfoundland Ice Dogs. Now, Paul and I, we're Newfoundlanders. This is our home team, so of course we're there. We're rooting for the home team. And our team was doing really well. I mean, they were having a great game. They were up. They were winning. And everything was great. We were enjoying ourselves until the refs made what I thought was a really bad call. Now, you might not know this about me, but I'm a rather passionate person, and I can be a little outspoken at times. So I stood up and I yelled out, "Hey, ref, my dead grandfather has better eyesight than you. Hey, why don't you do your drinking after the game?" Now, I thought I was funny. And some of the people around me, they thought I was funny too. But there was a guy sitting there, and he recognized my voice. And I don't know if it was from the radio or the internet, but he turned around and he looked at me and he said, "Hey, aren't you a pastor? I thought you were a pastor." And with that, I turned red and I was so embarrassed, I actually sat down in my seat and I didn't say a word for the rest of the evening. Why? Because what came out of my mouth was beneath my calling, not only as a pastor, but as a Christian. Last week I asked the question, do you have a problem tongue? And here's the thing. Everybody has a problem tongue. Everybody, at some point in your life, you say something that as soon as it leaves your mouth, you regret it, or later on, when you think back on it, you wished you hadn't said it. And some of us, we wish that we could go back in time and take back that thing we said. But here's the thing. You can't go back and you can't take it back. And the truth of the matter is, the Bible recognizes everybody has a problem tongue. At some point in life, we all say things we're going to regret. And so the Bible has things to say about not only the power of our words, but about the taming of our tongue. And in the book of James, we are asked this question, can you tame your tongue? Now, where do I get that from? Well, take your Bibles, turn with me to the book of James. We're going to be spending our time there this morning. And it's James, it's chapter 3, and we're going to start reading in verse 2. And this is what it says. "Indeed, we all make mistakes." Actually, it reads, "Indeed, we all make many mistakes. For if we could control our tongues, we would be perfect and could also control ourselves in every other way." Now, I want you to stop for a moment, and I want you to think about who's writing this. You see, whenever you get into a new book in the Bible, you should ask yourself a couple of questions. Who's writing, and why are they writing? Well, this is James. Now, this is not James, the brother of John, the sons of thunder. By the way, why were they called the sons of thunder? Because of what came out of their mouth. This is not that James. This is James, the brother of Jesus. And what you may not know is that at first, James had a hard time believing that his brother Jesus was the Son of God or that he actually was God. I mean, think about it. What would it take for you to convince your siblings to worship you as God? You see the problem? So what changed James' mind? What happened? Well, Jesus did. You see, James grew up watching Jesus from the cradle to the grave to the resurrection. And James, he lived with Jesus. He grew up with Jesus. He watched Jesus his entire life. And James knew Jesus so well that the theme of his book is this: I know who the Christians are because they act like Jesus. So for James, the test of being a Christian wasn't perfection. Now, how do we know this? Well, because James said this: everybody makes mistakes. And he didn't say we just make mistakes. He said we make many mistakes. The test of a Christian is not perfection. It may be your goal, and it's a good goal, but the test of a Christian is whether or not, well, you treat the poor like Jesus did. You love your neighbor the way Jesus did, or you love everybody the way Jesus loved everybody, or you treated the orphans and the widows the same way Jesus did. The test for James was whether or not you acted like Jesus, and that also included what did or did not come out of your mouth. And so James is telling us today that the tongue, Our tongues can actually set the direction and the course for the rest of our lives. And this is why this is so important, because the things you say today have an impact on the people around you for tomorrow. Maybe you're old enough to remember, well, her name was Karen Carpenter. Karen and her brother Richard, back in the 70s and 80s, were a famous brother and sister singing duo. And they sang songs like Close to You, We've Only Just Begun, Top of the World, Rainy Days and Mondays. And maybe you remember them. Paul McCartney said that Karen Carpenter had the best female voice in all the world. Here's what you might also remember. In 1983, Karen died of a heart attack that was brought on by a disease known as anorexia nervosa. And when she died, she actually was reduced to about 77 pounds. Actually, she was thinner than you see in the picture on your right. And everybody wondered, how in the world could this happen to this beautiful young woman? I mean, she was gifted, she was talented, and she was not only famous, but everybody loved her, everybody liked her. And so the question was, how could this go wrong? How did this happen to her? And finally, one day, they figured it out. You see, they traced it back to a magazine article in which she was referred to as Richard's chubby little sister. And that barb, it went into her heart. And it ate at her, and it ate at her, until finally it reduced her to nothing but skin and bones. You see, James is trying to tell us that our tongue has a powerful impact on the lives of those around us, and that, well, our tongue, it needs to be bridled. Now, where do I get that from? Well, it's from James 3:3. We can make a horse, a large horse, go wherever we want by means of a small bit in its mouth. Now, if you've never ridden a horse, here's what you need to know. They are bigger and more powerful than we are. A horse can weigh anywhere from 380 kilograms to 1,000. For those of you who are Americans, that can weigh up to about 2,200 pounds. And again, you need to know this animal, it is bigger than you, it is more powerful. But if you put a bit in its mouth, you can direct it with as little pressure as a kilogram. So James' point is, it doesn't take a lot, because your tongue, it's not the horse, it's the bridle, and it will direct the course of your life. It was Benjamin Franklin who put it this way, talking about the power of things that are small. He said, for the want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For the want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For the want of a horse, the rider was lost. For the want of a rider, the battle was lost. For want of a battle, the kingdom was lost, and all for the want of a horseshoe nail. And the question that James is asking, and I'm asking this morning, is this: how many things in this world have been lost? All for the want of a kind, compassionate, and caring word. And James is telling us is that even though we are full beings with free will, our tongues are the bridles that direct our lives. And that something so small as our tongue, well, it can direct our lives like a rudder on a ship. And if that sounds familiar, that's James 3 and it's verse 4. And it reads, and a small rudder makes a huge ship turn wherever the pilot chooses to go, even though the winds are strong. Now, some of the biggest ships in the world right now are cruise ships. As a matter of fact, your average cruise ship can weigh anywhere from 250,000 metric tons and up. As a matter of fact, the average cruise ship could make the Titanic look like, well, a small pleasure boat. Now, here's what you need to know about a cruise ship. It does have a rudder, and this is the size of its rudder. Now, I'm hoping you can see this online at home. It has 4 rudders, but 2 directed going forward and 2 directed coming back. But please don't miss my point or James. Look at how small that rudder is. And what James is telling us, it doesn't matter if a storm blows in. It is not the wind or the waves that direct the ship, it's the rudder. And here's the thing. Right now, you and I, we are caught in a storm. It is COVID-19. It's this global pandemic. And what James is telling us, it's not the situation you're in, it's the words you're using right now that are going to steer the course of your life. And what James is saying is, well, everybody talks to themselves. You talk to yourself, I talk to myself. As a matter of fact, right now, as you're listening to this message, you're talking to yourself. You're talking about the message. You're talking about being at home. You're talking about missing church and the people at church. You're even talking about James and what I'm talking about right now. Every single one of us, we talk to ourselves. I do it a lot. Sometimes we're driving down the road, and my wife will look at me, and she'll say, "You're talking to yourself." And the reason she says that is because I'm nodding my head, I'm twitching my hands, my head's going back and forth, and she knows I'm having an internal conversation. And she's wondering if I'm arguing, if I'm studying, or if I'm preaching in my mind. But don't get me wrong, I talk to myself. And sometimes it's in my head, and sometimes I talk out loud. When I was a teenager, I worked for my uncle, Jerry Morgan. And Jerry, we were installing vinyl siding. And one day, I guess I was talking to myself, but I was talking out loud. And my uncle Jerry turned to me and he said, "You know, people who talk to themselves, they're either crazy or they're rich." And I responded with, "Well, you pay my wage, you tell me." But you get what I'm saying. Every single one of us, we're talking to ourselves right now about the storm we're in. And what you need to understand is that COVID-19 is not going to determine the direction of your life. It's the words you use that are going to impact and influence you and those around you. And James is telling us is that our tongue, it's like a rudder. It will determine the course of your life. So what I want you to think about are the words you're using right now. Are they impacting and influencing your life and the lives of those around you? You see, we all know the truth of this. Think about two students. Student A and student B are required by their teacher to give a presentation in the front of their class. And student A says, "You know what? I got this. I've studied. I prepared. My classmates like me. I know I'm going to ace this presentation." Student B, on the other hand, says, "You know what? I'm not prepared. I don't think my classmates like me. I don't think I'm going to do well. I'm going to be nervous. I'm going to blow this presentation." Now, let me ask you, of the two, which one do you think is more likely to succeed, student A or student B? Well, of course, student A. Why? Because they're speaking an expectation of success into their own life. And friends, right now you are talking to yourself and you are speaking expectation into your life and into the lives of those around you. And what you need to know is that those words are either going to light up your life or it's going to burn down the world. Again, where do I get that from? Well, it's from James. It's 3 and it's 5. And it reads, "In the same way, the tongue is a small thing that makes grand speeches, but a tiny spark can set a great forest fire." Let me ask you something. Have you ever set a forest on fire? I have a friend, a former church member actually, who loved fires. I mean, he loved the smell of the smoke. He loved the crackling of the fire. He loved the dance of the flames. Now, if you love the out of doors and you like camping, you know exactly what it was that he loved. So any excuse Henry could find to start a fire, he would. Now, Henry owned a quarter section of land. It's a lot of acreage. And he had some pasture, and it was filled with old dead grass and some brambles and some bushes. And Henry thought, well, the quickest way to, clear the pasture would be a controlled burn. Now, a lot of people out west, they do controlled burns. It's not uncommon. And so Henry checked the weather. The wind was supposed to be low that day. So he grabbed a couple of buckets of water and he set a fire in his field. And at first, everything was going great until the wind picked up. And out of nowhere, the wind literally picked up this small flame. It turned it into a blaze, and that blaze jumped from his pasture into the forest next door. So, imagine my surprise when I sit down that night for supper. I'm watching the evening news, and on the news is a forest fire that's actually not far from where I live. And on the news, I see fire trucks, and I see firemen, I see forestry, I see water bombers, and then I see Henry. He's on the news trying to explain how his controlled burn got out of control and turned into a forest fire. And what James is telling us is that what might seem small or insignificant to you, what might seem like just an off word or a careless word, it didn't really mean anything, that little spark, that little thing you say can either light up the world or it can burn it down. Case in point, there was a young German man who was an artist, and he loved art. Now, I'm not an art critic, but I've seen some of his paintings, and I thought, wow, this is pretty good. I mean, the guy had talent. As a matter of fact, this is one of his paintings. It sold at an auction for about $440,000. That's almost $500,000. And I'm looking at this, and I thought, well, for a young man, he had talent, he had potential, and some of his paintings today still sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars. That requires a little talent. So he decided, based on the encouragement of those around him, to apply to the Vienna School of Fine Arts. And he presented his work to a professor. And historians think that this man might have been Jewish, but the jury is kind of out on that. But regardless, when the professor looked at this young man's work, he was harsh and he was unkind. And he basically said, you're not an artist, you're an architect. Go to architect school, you don't belong here. As a matter of fact, one person reflecting on his work had this to say. Speaking of his paintings, they are prosaic, utterly devoid of rhythm, color, feeling, or spiritual imagination. They are architect sketches, painful and precise draftsmanship, nothing more. Well, the young man was wounded and he was hurt. And so a young Adolf Hitler turned from art to politics. And as historians reflect on that encounter, that pivotal moment in Adolf Hitler's life, this is what historian Volker Ulrich has to say. By his own estimation, speaking of Hitler, who actually wonders the same thing, by his own estimation and that of scholars, this rejection went on to shape his metamorphosis from a bohemian aspiring artist into the human manifestation of evil. We can only speculate as to how history would have been different, but it is safe to assume that a great deal of tragedy could have been avoided if Hitler had applied himself to watercolors and not genocide. Now, let me be clear. This does not in any way, shape, or form excuse Hitler from the decisions he made. He made those choices. But don't miss what the scholars are saying, and even Hitler himself. How might the world have been different if somebody had used a kind word rather than a harsh criticism? How might those words have set him on a different course and have maybe changed human history? But the problem is we'll never know. But don't miss James' point. A small word, a harsh criticism, something that might seem thoughtless or careless can actually, burn down the world. A small spark into a raging forest fire. And so James said, your tongue, your words have the power to either light up the world or burn it down. So maybe you're listening to my message this morning and you're thinking to yourself, I get it. All of us, not just me, not just you, but all of us on this planet, we make many mistakes. We're not perfect, and because we're not perfect, we've got a problem tongue. So the question maybe you're asking yourself this morning is this: can we tame the tongue? And my answer is yes. James didn't write this to leave you hopeless or to accuse you. Please, this series is not about accusing you, it's about helping you, to tame your tongue. And so, there are two things this morning, very quickly, I want to recommend that can help you tame your tongue. And the first is this: think before you speak. Now, let's be honest here. There's nothing new here. But what are we really talking about when we say think before you speak? Well, what we're talking about is the need to filter what comes out of our mouth. That's what thinking before you speak means. It means to literally filter your words, to think about what will my words do? What impact will they have on those around me? And as I look at the world today, I think more people could use a little more filters around the things they have to say. I mean, I go on YouTube Facebook, Instagram, and other social media sites. And there are times I'll see something or I'll read something and I'll think to myself, friend, what you need a filter. This happened in one of my churches a few years back. There was a lady in the church who did not like a decision the board had made, and she became upset. But instead of coming back to the board and talking about it, or even coming to an elder or myself, she took her complaint to Facebook, and she went online, and she was not kind, and she did not hold back. She told the world, and she told all of her friends and all of those people who were reading her, her post, that how unfair her church was, what a bunch of hypocrites they were, and how she didn't want to go back and would recommend that nobody go to this church. 6 months later, she reconciled with us, reconciled with her church family, got it all figured out, came to understand it was just one big misunderstanding. And so she entered back into ministry and was putting together a program. And with her team, they put together, it was a great program. A lot of work, talent, effort, and creativity went into the program. It was a good program. Then she invited her friends, and none of them showed. None of them would come to our church to see her program. And I thought to myself, I wouldn't. The words she had posted on Facebook, they were still out there. Would you go to a church where the members were advertising to the world, my church is filled with hypocrites, it's not safe, I wouldn't go back there? You see, she didn't think about what she had said, and she didn't filter her words. And so her words had actually killed her witness and the witness of her church. And none of her friends, none of them would come to her presentation, to her program. You see, I can't help but wonder how many times our witness is killed because we did not put a filter on our mouths. And you see, friends, it is so important to think about the impact of your words before you say them. You need to ask yourself, if I say this, what damage might it do? What good might it do? And you need to filter your words accordingly. And friends, sometimes it's not only best to filter your words, but sometimes it's best to just not say anything at all. This from Proverbs 29:20. There is more hope for a fool than for someone who speaks without thinking. And Proverbs 18:6 and 7 we read, fools' words get them into constant quarrels. They are asking for a beating. The mouths of fools are their ruin. They trap themselves with their lips. This is the Bible's way of saying there are times when you're better off not saying anything at all. I'm reminded of a poem. It's called The Wise Old Owl, and I want to read it for you. It says, a wise old owl sat in an oak. The more he heard, the less he spoke. The less he spoke, the more he heard. Why aren't we all like that good old bird? Folks, this is what Scripture is saying to us, both James and Solomon, that you need to think about the power of your words, and that if you want to tame your tongue, you need to filter it, and maybe sometimes you're better off not saying anything at all. This is what Proverbs 17:28 says. Even fools are thought wise when they keep silent. With their mouths shut, they seem intelligent. We have a saying that goes something like this. It is better to be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. Friend, if you want to tame your tongue, the first thing you want to do is to filter your words, to make sure to check that if you say something, you want to check its impact on those around you. And maybe you want to consider that maybe the best course of action is to say nothing at all. Well, that's the first thing you can do. You can literally filter your words, think before you speak. And the second thing you can do is this: have a change of heart. Now, you see, here's why I say this. The problem with your words, it isn't your tongue. You see, I asked if you have a problem tongue, but the truth is, maybe I should be asking, do you have a problem heart? Because you see, every word, everything that we do is the product of what comes out of our heart. Jesus said it best. It was Matthew 12:34 and 35. You brood of snakes, How could evil men like you speak what is good and right? For whatever is in your heart determines what you say. A good person produces good things from the treasury of a good heart, and an evil person produces evil things from the treasury of an evil heart. This goes back to what James is saying. I know if you're a Christian based on what you do or do not say. His name was Jim, and he was a prisoner in a federal state prison. And James was an angry, bitter man. And you knew it. You knew it because of what came out of his mouth. I mean, he was bitter. He was angry. He would spew poison. He verbally abused everybody around him. And then one day he met two Christian men. They were with prison ministries. And one day they invited Jim to come and be a part of one of their studies. Now, Jim didn't believe in God. Jim didn't like God. And in no uncertain terms, Jim told them in very colorful language, in very abusive language, that he would have nothing to do with their so-and-so God. But these men were not to be deterred. They were experienced. You see, they understood the pain and the anger behind Jim's words. So they persisted. And they persisted. And they persisted until one day Jim finally said, okay, guys, I give in. If for no other reason than to get you off my back, I'll go to one of your studies. And true to his word, he did. But he was colorful, and he was abusive, and he was angry. But he came back the next week. And he came back the week after that. And then one day he heard something, and he asked a question. And the answer to his question raised other questions. And he'd get an answer, and he'd have a question, and he'd have an answer, and he'd have a question. And soon enough, Jim began to discover that the questions for his life, the answers, they were found in Jesus. So much so that one day somebody came up to Jim and they said, Jim, you're different. You've changed. And how did they know Jim had changed? Well, because of what was coming out of his mouth. Jim had given up cursing and swearing. He gave up the verbal abuse. He gave up the bitterness and the anger. And now Jim, when they met him, it was encouragement. It was hope. It was humor. It was laughter. It was cheer. And somebody asked him, Jim, what happened? Why are you so different? And if you were to ask him the same question today, Jim would tell you, it's because once Jesus got a hold of his heart, it changed what came out of his mouth. So friend, let me ask you, do you have a problem tongue? Do you have something going on in your heart and it's affecting what's coming out of your mouth? Because here's what I know. Right now, you're in a storm. It is COVID-19. It is a global pandemic. And right now, you have some pretty strong feelings. Right now, you may be feeling anxious. You're worried. You're concerned. Some of you right now, you're angry and you're afraid. You lost your job and you don't know what the future holds. And you're talking to yourself and you're talking to the people around you. And right now, yes, you've got a problem tongue. So what do you do about it? Well, here's the thing. I'm not asking you to change the way you feel. That wouldn't be fair. You have a right to feel the way you feel. But can I make a suggestion? As your brother in Christ, as your friend, as your pastor, here's what I'd like you to do with those feelings. Talk about them. But the person I want you to talk to is Jesus. I want you to get close to Jesus. So right now, sometime this week, I want you to find a private spot. Somewhere just where you and Jesus, you can be alone and talk to him. Tell him about your feelings. Tell him why you feel the way you do. And then, because I know you have the time right now, get into the Word of God and let Jesus speak to you through the Bible. And here's what he's going to do. He's going to speak to your fear. He's going to speak to that worry. He's going to speak to that anxiety. And what's going to happen is that his grace, his love, his kindness, his compassion are going to come into your heart, and it's going to start changing your heart. And what changes your heart is going to change your words. And what affects your words? Well, you see, words, they affect your thoughts. Your thoughts impact your feelings. Your feelings, they affect the decisions you make, and your decisions, they result in actions, and those actions will produce character over time. And the thing you got that character, that is what will determine the direction of your life. And so if you take your feelings, if you take your heart and you give it to Jesus, He's going to transform your heart so that those words will change your thoughts. It'll change your feelings. It'll change your decisions. It'll change your actions. And it will change your characters. So much so that when people encounter you, they will know you're a Christian because of what's going to come out of your mouth. So let me ask you, how do you tame the tongue? Give your heart to Jesus. And today, if you give Him your heart, it will change your words. And like a rudder, it will change the direction of your life. No matter the storm, no matter the wind, no matter the waves, if your heart belongs to Jesus, so does your tongue, and so does the direction of your life. So don't let COVID-19 or your words determine your life. Allow the grace of God to change you, and then allow it to direct you. That's my message for today. Thank you for watching. God bless.